shouldn't say that. I should
Dr.
say
Mike,
I hate making opening remarks. I don't know why I keep getting in these positions. Anyway, welcome everybody. What a way to spend a wonderful Friday morning. But we do appreciate you taking the time because this is a very important topic. It certainly is educational to me. I swear, the more I learn, the more questions, the more I have to dig even farther. So I'm really looking forward to hearing these presentations from NCDOT and ITRI, which is a brand new entity to me. But it's been very educational, and it's important because I think vast majority of CRT-VO board members have no clue that transit was even part of our Billiwack. So that's very good. So I'm glad this topic has come up. And really going to Beyond 77 and Connect Beyond, transit is becoming even more and more thrust into the forefront, and CRTPO will have to be dealing with these issues even more so. So the more we know, the better in that regard. And the comments.
all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Miltic. And it looks as though your vice chair has just arrived. Talk
Good.
about perfect timing.
Timing and placement are everything.
Linda Paxton has just joined us now. And of course, she is the CARPO's vice chair. I will tell you that Michael Johnson, who is the chair of our task force, that is our Transit Education Initiative Task Force, is not able to join us today. He had an important obligation. Just briefly, a friend of his who is 80 years old is receiving an award and a recognition for lifetime service today at the University of South Carolina. So Michael felt that these occasions don't come along often, and it was important to attend. Having said that, I want everybody who's on the call to know that Michael has been very closely involved in the preparation of today's program on Federal Transit Administration funding regulations and how they impact CARPO entities. He's very well aware of this. We are recording the session today so that he can watch it and understand all of the information that's been covered, the questions that are asked, etc. I want to invite you now to sort of strap into your seats, my friends. You will have an opportunity to be released at 11:15. We're going to take a break, so a little bit more than an hour from now. We'll have what I like to call a biological break for stretching and other purposes. And then we'll come right back and finish up our session by absolutely no later than 12:30. So let's get going. And our operator today for our slides, because there are, as you can see on the screen, we have 4 presenters today. Jarrell Leonard, who is CARPO's first ever transit planner, Pam DiGiovanni, from the North Carolina Department of Transportation. She is an IMD there, and she's going to tell you what that means. I can never, mobility, Pam, help. Where are you?
Is integrated mobility.
Integrated mobility, yes. And she is the interim supervisor west. Jeremy Scott, who many of you know, is from ITRI. He is a research associate. And then David McDonald, the CATS Transit Planning Manager. So our wonderful Theo Thompson is going to advance the slides. Theo, let's get going. So today's focus, as you can see, is on the relevant federal funding regulations that impact all of our local transit agencies. We are also going to be looking quickly at ROPE and SMAP, because those are the North Carolina state funding regulations, primarily for rural transit, but for other activities as well. We want to just review where things stand with those particular laws. We'll also touch on the CARES Act very briefly. A lot of you are wondering where things stand in terms of the release of funds that have come into our MPO related to CARES. So we'll touch briefly on that, but primarily want to focus on what are the regulations, how are funds dispersed under those regulations and provisions, what do you have to do to qualify for those funds. And we're going to take this in numerical order today, other than 5307. We will, up until the break, we're going to be covering all of the other federal provisions. We'll stop for that 11:15 break, and then we'll follow through with a thorough discussion of 5307. If you have questions as we're going, I'm going to ask you to pop into the chat box and type them there. You can also, anybody, by the way, and Theo, let's go to the next slide here. Anybody on the task force who's with us today, and you can see our members here, Michael Johnson, Michael Miltick, Linda Paxton, Richard Buchanan. Good morning, Richard. Jeff Crouchley here with us from Iredell County, from ICATS. Janet Payne, who's on the phone today. Her colleague Teresa Torres is here to represent Union as well, since Janet is, I believe, driving at this point. David McDonald is here, and of course, our staff are here as support for this initiative. Anybody who is a member of the task force can unmute themselves and ask a question at any point during the program. However, we would ask any of our guests who are here with us today to hold your questions, either type them into the chat box as they arise, as they occur to you, or you can hold your questions until 11:15 when we'll take that break. Right after the break, we can get them. And then at the end of our program, we've reserved 15 minutes at the conclusion of the prepared remarks, so that we want this to be a session where people feel as though they can have specific questions answered throughout the course of the program. All right, Theo, well, let's look at some of the issues that are going to impact funding. And by the way, first bullet point is very important, everybody who's on the call. Please pay attention to this one. How a local agency chooses to report national transit database information is going to impact grant eligibility and grant awards amount from the federal government. And other entities that offer funding also may look at this NTD information. Note that your annual reports, local agencies, are due on October 31st. And from everything that's been explained to me, and you know, I'm your average person on the street when it comes to understanding transit issues. I don't. Everything that I know, I've had to learn as a result of my moderation and facilitation of this process. So I'm the every person, and it's been explained to me that once you provide your information on October 31st, basically your cake is baked. You can't go back and change that data. So you'll want to be perhaps consulting with some of the people on this call, if that would be useful or helpful to you before you provide that information this year. And other considerations that impact funding, you know, data look back periods for different regulations, grants under different regulations vary depending on the section of the Federal Transit Administration Code. You know that local match requirements differ. So you, depending on what type of a grant you're seeking, you may have to match at 20% or even 50%. And we all understand that. We also want to think ahead, you know, as we think prospectively. The 2020 census is going on right now. The results won't be available for another 2 years, or they won't be finalized, or I think certified is actually the right word. But we have a sense that a lot of the rural area in this part of our state is no longer going to be categorized as rural. So what does that mean for the way you report data and obtain funding? Here's a wild card. Will the North Carolina State Legislature reinstate ROPE and SMAP after next year? We know that there is a 1-year hiatus on that funding, but will it be reinstated? That's another question that local agencies have to consider. And then, you know, if Michael Johnson were here with us on this call this morning, he would make the point to anybody who would listen to him that, you know, for the most part, people in our communities do not just drive around our local community or bike around our local community or take the bus or the train. For the most part, we are traveling from one place to another. And as we said at the outset of our task force initiative, you know, we will rise as a region, and thinking regionally has to be part of the consideration when we think about funding for transit. Theo, let's keep going here, because it's time for me to introduce and turn over the controls to Jarrell Leonard, our Carpo Transit Planning professional. Jarrell, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the Federal Transit Administration? Let's really set the table here.
Most certainly. So the main topic we're going to talk about on this slide is what is the Federal Transit Administration. So the Federal Transit Administration provides financial and technical assistance to any public transit system that receives federal dollars. It is the successor of the former Urban Mass Transit Administration, which was its predecessor, in 1964, and since then has helped state and local governments enhance public transportation. Their primary goal is the investment has helped modernize, help regulate, extend service of transit, not only to the communities in urban areas, but also rural areas across the United States. Let's move along. So in its role, the Federal Transit Administration provides financial assistance to help improve, maintain, and operate existing transit systems. Some of their primary requirements is to monitor grantees who receive the funds to make sure federally funded projects confirm and follow all federal mandated requirements, policies, and procedures. They also make sure that these operators who receive funds demonstrate legal, financial, and technical obligations and carry them out to fully. Another main point that they have to exist is to comply with any applicable civil rights, statutes, regulations, or provisions. And finally, foremost, the FTA also maintains the applicable asset management and also safety requirements for any public transit program or recipient. Let's move along. So the programs we're going to focus on today are Section 5303, which is what CARPO, or also known as CRTPO, maintains. 5310, CATS, Charlotte Area Transportation. 5311, which is maintained by NCDOT, particularly the Integrated Mobility Division, also known as IMD. 5337, also maintained by CATS. 5339, maintained by CATS as well. 5340, CATS as well as NCDOT maintains that. And 5307, which all of us have something to do with: CATS, CRTPO, NCDOT. And then we're also going to talk about the state programs known as ROAP, Rural Operating Assistance, and SMAP. I always forget it's Surface Management Assistance Program. All right, moving along. So first thing first, what we're going to talk about is 5303. 5303 is the Transit Planning, Design, Engineering Funding Program. It covers everything that everybody wants to know, how you pay for things usually on an annual basis. So moving along. NCDOT is the designee of 5303. However, CRTPO is the local administrator of it. The funds flow from FTA to NCDOT and from NCDOT to CRTPO. And once CRTPO receives it, then it's dispersed out to the local eligible transit agencies. The match required is 80-20, 80% federal, 20% local. Moving along. NCDOT's formula is dispersed based on four metrics: population, vehicle revenue miles, and ridership. And also vehicle, apologies, wait, no, it is four metrics. I apologize. Population, vehicle revenue hours, vehicle revenue miles, and ridership. Following up, a supplement is provided to MPOs that are 1 million plus in population. And moving along. So we're gonna pass the torch to our friends at CATS to cover this portion.
All right, so everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All
Thanks,
right.
David.
So 5310, go ahead and advance the first bullet in. The key thing is, first and foremost, 5310 provides funding for the needs of the elderly and individuals with disabilities within our urbanized area. CATS is a designated recipient, and the funds pass through us. Depending on if it's capital or operating, it's pretty standard, 80% match for capital, 50 for operating. Go ahead again. One quirk with this program is that 55% of the funding must go toward capital. And that's kind of a measurement. The remaining 45% can go to operating, but you have to spend the 55%. If you don't have any capital projects, you can't spend any on operating. And both capital and operating costs, of a contracted service count as capital. So in other words, if you provide purchase transportation, if you pay someone to provide transportation, that counts as capital. Let's go ahead to the next one. Because these funds are eligible not only for transit agencies and operators, they're also eligible to nonprofits. We found the best way to award these funds is through a competitive process, and that's how we do it. We'll do the next one. And the data from the census is used to determine it. So they look at the elderly and disabled population within our urbanized area as comparison to all the urbanized areas within the country to get the formula for our share. All right. And then finally down here, well, not finally, I got a couple other slides, but this is another important point. 10% can be utilized by the designated recipient to administer the 5310 program. CATS does draw those funds because we are legally and financially responsible for the actions of the subrecipients. And so we utilize a portion of the funding to manage the program and ensure compliance with those federal regulations that Gerald talked about earlier. All right. In 2017 and 2018, those funds have been received and awarded to selected projects. And if you click it again, 19 and 20 funds are being prepared for a call for projects. Just for perspective, the 17 amount was just under 860,000, is 847,000. 18 was 891,000. 19 is 920, and FY20 is 962,000. So expect to see a call for projects in a couple months or so related to the 19 and 20 funding. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. And the next.
Before we go, David, is anybody interested in knowing, who received those awards? Maybe we could, David, I know you were going to be prepared to speak to that because of the fact that there are nonprofits that are associated with this distribution. Do you want to just share that?
Sure. In the FY17 awards, Iredell County received capital. On the capital side, it was Iredell County, Metrolina Association for the Blind, which is a nonprofit. The Centralina region, I think is their new name. The COG basically received funding on the capital side. Disability Rights and Resources is another nonprofit that received funding. And then on the operating side, Metrolina Association for the Blind received money, as well as Union County. And then CATS, of course, took the admin amount. For 18, it was on the capital side, Iredell County received funding. the COG, disability rights again, and then on the operating side, Metro Line Association for the Blind, Iredell County and Union County received the funding. And again, CATS took 10% for operating, or admin, sorry. And so we'd anticipate CATS will take the admin amounts as well. There's a committee that is put together to evaluate the submitted projects and make recommendations for award. And so I believe there were some openings on that committee, and they'd asked for recommendations from other agencies if they had folks they would recommend be on it. So if you need some more information about that, I can try and get that to you. All right.
Good. Thank you, David.
Sure. All right. Let's move on to the 5311, and that'd be Pam.
Thanks, David. Good morning, everyone. The 5311 program is guided and administered by the Federal Transit Administration, and they provide formula funds for all the states as it relates to capital planning and operating assistance. There's also the national, if you just want to go back, the National Rural Transportation Assistance Program is also a program that is funded through this FTA 5311 formula funds. And what they do is provide training, free training and technical assistance to all the state RTAP managers in addition to the state transit operators. So that's also a great resource for the operators if they need assistance with free training materials and other items. Next slide. So as an overview, North Carolina receives the allocation from the FTA to administer the funds to all the state subrecipients for administration, operating, and capital replacement for rural transit. The federal share for capital projects is 80% and it's 50% for operating assistance. There is the formula methodology that goes into as the state allocates these funds throughout our all our 79 subrecipients that we have. The formula consists of land area, population, revenue vehicle miles, and we also take into account the low income in the rural areas. Other eligible recipients include the tribes as well within North Carolina, and as well as the county governments. Next slide. So in this slide, we just provided just a bird's eye 5-year overview of the allocations for this regional area that consists of Iredell, Mecklenburg, and Union County. Next slide. Oh, David, you're muted.
Sorry about that. The mouse got lost again. Okay, so I think this transitions to me to talk about 5337, which is state of good repair funds for basically fixed guideway and high intensity motor bus. So let's go to, there you go. Go ahead and click once. CATS is the designated recipient for the funds for the urbanized area. And in this case, CATS is the only operator of rail fixed guideway. And at the current time, we're the operator of high intensity motor bus. So go ahead and click, I think a couple times here. There we go. There's the formulas for both the rail side and for high intensity fixed guideway. If we go ahead and go again. the high intensity motor bus funds are kind of allocated based on revenue miles and route miles reported to the NTD. Let's do another one. And we'll go ahead and talk about the funds. So this last year at FY, I think that should have been FY20, but 2.3 million in fixed guideway funding and $546,000 for high intensity motor bus. Fixed guideway, you have to actually have the project up and running for 7 years before you start getting funding. So that's another interesting quirk, but that funding is available when it comes to CATS right now. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So that was the fixed guideway side of things for state of good repair. Only 5339 is talking about the, basically it's kind of a state of good repair for the bus and bus facility side. This is a little interesting in that it used to be that these funds were discretionary only. And so this is the pot of, or the category that you get new starts, grants in, other major awards. And you either have to compete for them or you get a congressional, earmark. Good click. But now there is a formula portion of that, and that's what I'm going to talk about mostly with this slide. So CATS, again, is the designated recipient of these funds, and we're responsible for managing them. FTA apportions them to urbanized areas, smaller ones and larger ones like us. Hit it again. These funds can only be spent on capital. And when these funds were first made available as a formula fund, they could not be utilized, they could not be split. And so when we started sharing them initially, we had to come up with a way to share them without adding subrecipients. We wanted at that time, we wanted to avoid that. And so what we did is we tried to create some flexibility with 5307 funds. We do the calculation for that. We do the calculation for 5339, and then CATS trades the 5339 funds that would be due to the other agencies for an equal amount of 5307. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I think it's easier to see in it what we do.
And David, if I may,
yeah.
If anybody, we have plenty of time this morning.
Yeah.
Our program is charging right along, and this is complicated. So if anybody has a question on our task force, please ask your question. You're not interrupting our flow. This program is for all of us to understand, better how this funding process works. So please jump in. Is there a question now for David or another one of our speakers? Anybody? And you have to unmute yourself in order to ask a question. I always forget about that.
Let me finish talking through this slide, and then that stimulates some questions. But we do the calculations, the local calculations for the 5307 share, and you can see the amounts on the left column. And then the one that's highlighted in the middle, this is the calculation of the shares for 5339. A key thing is that the formula for 5339 from the federal is basically mimics the 5307. And so we take those same proportions to share 5339. What we didn't do is we look at the amount that would go to Iredell, Mecklenburg, Union, and Rock Hill. And we decrease the amount of 5307 that CATS receives and increase the amount of 5307 that those agencies receive to equal the 5339. What this means is at the end, CATS keeps all the 5339 money, but we take less 5307 funds. Because 5307 can be used for capital or operating, or a combination of both, we feel like this provides more flexibility. And it's only one pot of money that has to be split out. And as I said initially, you couldn't split it. In subsequent federal regs, they allow these funds to be split. But we've continued to go because we feel like it provides more flexibility. And so that's how we kind of get to the total here and how we handle 5339. So if there's questions related to that, I'd be happy to try to answer those or anything else we've covered so far.
David,
Yeah.
you say it increases flexibility. Does it include flexibility to CATS or to the other agencies, or both?
It should increase flexibility to the other agencies because we're giving them a pot of money that can be used on just about anything. 5307 is the most flexible pot of money.
I thought I heard that right.
The matter to CATS is because we can only use 5307 for capital anyways. And so by keeping the 5339, we also have the ability, we can write grants now that can have multiple pots of money within the same grant. So, you know, we're better able to adjust to it and utilize the funds, but in the end, the total's the same, and I would hope the flexibility is seen to be the same or a benefit. We discussed this with Raleigh. They do split the 5339, but when they looked at our method, they thought we were giving much more flexibility. So this is something that we've continued to do, but you know, if someone wanted to split it instead, we could do that. It just means then you'd have two pots of money to deal with at the in the smaller agencies through NCDOT.
So David, is part of that swap arrangement because the smaller agencies are not doing as many capital projects, so this allows them to get more of the 5339 money?
I wouldn't be able to judge whether they're doing more or less capital projects. Typically, every agency capital operating is always a need, and they can use it for operating. On the capital side, I think that varies year to year, and so this gives them the flexibility that they could use it for either. And so, you know, but you'd have to have one of them speak to, you know, whether or not it's what the benefit is to them. So if they agree, then I think we keep doing what they're doing. If they don't, then we're happy to change it and do this as a split. So.
Other questions about this? This just points out to me this, you know, sort of swapping under these two sections, points out the degree of sophistication and complication that that the federal funding scheme contemplates and provides for. And the need to truly have a deep understanding in order to, you know, make the best decisions on behalf of a local transit agency, to have a deep understanding of how these provisions work. Anything else from the group? All right, let's keep going.
So 5340 is federal funds that are associated with growing states, high density states, and small transit intensive cities. And it's very much based on the census population. So this is not something that, I don't think, this one does not change on an annual basis. It's based on, well, the amount of money changes based on the appropriation, but the formula is based on the census data from 2010. So this will update after the next census. The key is that once the calculations are done on the urban and the rural side, they put the money added into 5307. So it's kind of seamless. Once we get the 5307 award, it includes this amount of money. In North Carolina, we're not a high density state. Most of those are up in the Northeast, and they're the kind of the smaller states. We do have some small transit intensive cities, but as the name implies, small transit or small is they're outside of the Charlotte region. So NCDOT deals with those funds, but none of that comes to our region. So for us, it's all focused on the growing states component. That's published in the table and then added to 5307. But if you break it out, The portion that is for North Carolina is $1.2 million, and the portion for South Carolina is $71,000, almost $800. And that's, you know, directly reported by FTA based on that calculation of a growing state. So be happy to try to answer any further questions about that. Other than that, it's like I said, once that calculation's done, it's added into the formula that the feds give us. They just add it on top. So, all right.
Well, if I may, we actually are at the point where we thought we were going to take our break before we got into 5307. So let's dial back. Theo, I'd like to ask you to go back to slide number, I'll tell you in a minute here. I got to get myself together. I'm going to ask you to go back to slide 7 and see if we have any questions about 5303 or 5310 or 5311. And slide number 7 kind of gives us is a placeholder there, so we can take a look at that together.
While she's going back to it, for 5303, there's one thing I would say is that last year there was a lot of effort by the North Carolina Association of MPOs working with the Intermodal Mobility Division to look at updating the formula for sharing those funds. And so the result of that is the distribution that was made last year. One of the items that was kind of identified there, and Jarrell talked about, we get supplemental money because we are an MPO over $1 million. That does factor in. We weren't receiving that before, so that's included now. After the census, it's likely that Charlotte and Raleigh will both be over $1 million. That calculation will have to be redone, but that did see a significant increase for our region. And so we, allows us to bring more money to kind of deal with the unique planning needs. And this was also the last time there was a call for needs from all of the agencies. And so I believe that all the operators are now receiving some of these planning funds, and something that it should be a call upcoming soon, for funding for next year as well. So start working on the UPWP. So something to be on the look for as your members are attending the MPO and TCC meetings, that they'll be looking to establish the 5303 funding for next year. So be prepared for your request for that. Jarrell, do you have anything to add to that?
Not necessarily. The call this year was the first time that CRTPO was able to award projects to all of our member entities within our planning area. So that's pretty much going to be a process moving forward. And short of that, that's pretty much all I can add to that.
Unmute Mary.
Yeah, you muted, Mary.
Good Lord. Don't unmute me. Don't mute me, she said to herself. If there are no further questions here, I mean, you're probably, folks from local agencies or transit agencies are certainly aware of the mix of these particular sections that we've covered up to 5339. And by the way, we anticipate that you might want to have conversations with members of our panel after this call, sidebar conversations to talk about maybe deepening the local understanding of some of these provisions, and that certainly would be appropriate and anticipated. But Theo, if you would, click out of the program, end the program, so that we can then go up to slide 20 very quickly. Slide 20 is 5340. And we want to talk about that before we get to 5307. Are you with me, Theo?
Theo, I think if you right click, you can select the slide number. There should be a drop down menu, allow you to get there faster.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Look at Theo go.
yeah.
I'm sorry, which slide do I need to be on?
I'd like slide number 20, please.
Okay, sorry.
I hope nobody gets whiplash from us
Right.
running through these.
Maybe it's not in there. Sorry,
Yeah, I
Thea.
can't see that, sorry.
I thought that used to be an option.
It probably is, and I can't find it.
Those good old days, David, right?
Yeah.
All right. Now we're ready to go on.
I think one more is 50, one more gets you 53.
There we are.
Yeah.
Okay. So David, tell us about this.
This one is all population driven. And so, and it's driven based on, you know, areas that are growing faster than the average. And so FTA does the calculation, the formulas are set. And for our region, you know, North Carolina is a fastly growing state. Charlotte's a fastly growing urban area. So they do that calculation and determine what the 5340 share is. But then in all cases, that 5340 amount is just added into 5307 at the very beginning and distributed. And so it's one of the things you can calculate it and know what it is. And that's what's shown here. But then after that, it just goes into 5307 for its award. So I don't know how much more to talk about this one. You know, this is one of the more simple ones, I think, as far as the money goes. It's just added into 5307.
Mm-hmm.
And a little later, when we talk about 5307, I've kind of got a flow chart that shows the federal formula. It includes where everything's added in. I could probably show you on that chart where that's added in.
Well, let's just keep going. I mean, if we finish early this morning, everybody will be, Dr. Michael Miltic can go out on the lake, on Lake Norman, and enjoy himself, and he will be very happy with all of us. So let's keep going.
Mary, this is Richard. I do have a question.
Okay.
Sir.
In regards to 5303 funds, which we're sharing this year, and with those funds, the projected uses, our plans for those, we submitted prior to coronavirus hitting or COVID hitting. So we have our plans with those that we laid out. We're not going to, at least in Mecklenburg, we're not going to be able to use the funds in exactly the same way that we had laid out prior to COVID because of just the state of the world right now. So my question is, will we be able to modify what we originally said within the scope of what 5303 allows? And then the second part of the question, are those funds fiscal year or do they carry out longer than just the one fiscal year?
Great questions.
So you can modify your fund, your request. We'll just go through the proper process. You put it in, you know, documentation so that we can be able to take that in, and we will most likely have to make some type of amendment to the list and to also the UPWP breakdown of 5303. So just correspond in writing to us exactly how do you change, you're planning on changing,
okay,
still being within the required activities allowed by 5303, and we will start that process.
Okay. And what about the length of the funding? Does it have to be spent within the current fiscal year, or?
To my knowledge, it's supposed to be, because it's year to year.
So I'll speak to that too, if you don't mind, Jarrell, is that, these funds are, they go through NCDOT. So FTA awards an NCDOT, then NCDOT is distributing them to the MPO, and then they distribute them further down. But technically, NCDOT is the manager of the formula funds, this pot of money, and their rules and guidance on this for many years has been that for 5303 funds, at the end of the year, what wasn't spent goes back to them after audit, then it gets redistributed to everybody. So each year what's put out there needs to be spent. Now, I know that for PL funds, if we had a multi-year thing, you kind of have to plan for that. We could probably definitely talk to Pam about how to do that, but I think you'd have to budget it to have a break point in each fiscal year so that you could handle that. So if you don't spend it, it doesn't carry over, it goes back and gets redistributed.
We're just being frank in Mecklenburg County with the COVID dollars that we've all been granted and things with that coming in slow. We're really worried about accepting it because we may not be able to spend it. And not that we're not grateful, but we also don't want to take something that we know we're not going to be able to utilize within the structure of where we sit in the world right now. So I'll reach out to Jarrell offline and talk more about that. Would you be the person to talk to?
Yes.
Okay.
There may be an opportunity, because others may have that same thing, that we might want to do this at a like one of the Wednesday station staff sessions or a special meeting where we could all kind of sit down and look, and if there are greater needs in one area and less in the other, it's possible we could shift some funds around so that we're making sure that we utilize the funds and that those that need it most are getting it. So,
and the big question I have on that, if we decline those funds this year, would we be eligible to apply and utilize them in future years?
Yeah, it's called for projects every year.
Okay.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, what we want to all do is make sure that the money we get is being spent, and for the betterment of the region. So, if we, if we just can't use it, we need to kind of make some shifts. So, and that's something I'm gonna have to take a look at too on the CAT side. So, there might be some opportunities for us to kind of talk about shifting some things around for everybody.
Yeah, I think
Mary,
COVID
this is
causing all
Bob
of our
Cook. I wanted
budgets.
to double check and ask David or Pam DiGiovanni, was there anything in the CARES Act that affected 5303 funds in terms of they are extended into the next fiscal year or anything of that sort?
I'm not aware of anything. I'd defer to Pam if she knows of anything related to that.
Same as David. I concur. I have not seen anything in relation to 5303. It's primarily been focused on operating, rather than the planning.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I see it.
And Teresa Torres just,
You're on mute, Mary.
okay, I've got it now. Teresa, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
How are we going to be let know when the call for project is? We haven't in the future, so I just want to make sure that's something that gets out to us.
So let me clarify. Are you talking about the call for projects for 5303 or for 5310?
So we, well, the 5310 would be great to know since it's kind of out there. And so going forward, like the 5339 that we are allowed to have access to and stuff like that, like it's never gone out to, I don't know about any other agency, but Union just found out about it this year when we went to a meeting.
So the 5339 is included within the 5307. So that's a straight formula calculation.
I'm sorry, the 5303.
Okay. So 5303, last year was the first year that they did a call for that. And Jarrell will oversee that. And I'm sure there'll be a notification that goes out to all of the members of the TCC. And I don't see why we couldn't copy all of the operators, right, Jarrell?
Yeah. So yeah, it went out late last year. It was a call for projects made in the TCC and also I believe board meeting itself. So we will just follow that similar announcement saying, hey, come one, come all, send us the projects that you.
And Mary, I want to be, I think for the record, I think it's important to be really clear about this with the 5303 money. Last year it is correct that last year was the first time we had issued a call for projects, but I think there's been some misunderstanding that it was never, that agencies were denied use of this money. And that's not correct. We had never received a request for 5303 money other than from CATS, and also the Metrolina regional model uses some of that money. But we had never denied any requests for 5303 money. We had never received any requests for 5303 money. So I just want the record to be very clear for members of the task force about what that situation was in the past.
And Bob, I appreciate your comment, and I just want to put out an observation. You know, like I said, I mean, I'm the least knowledgeable person on this call when it comes to transit funding. But I will say, as an outside observer, that the communication process, and it makes sense, right? Because Jarrell is the first ever transit planner that Carpo has had. And he was hired because there was a recognized need for somebody to serve as the clearing point for information about how do I get money for my local transit agency? What's the best way to do this? What's the advice? And so it seems to me as though the communication has not been great in terms of what's available, when it's available, how it's available, et cetera. And this is, I hope I'm not stepping out of my lane here, but it seems like there's a new opportunity here to create better lines of communication and information flow. Is that fair to say?
Oh, I completely agree with you. Having someone with Jarrell's background, it will help us tremendously. And so, yes, and I would agree that it just simply could have been a communication issue that when we were developing the work program, that it wasn't communicated to the agencies by TCC members and by us too. I'm not taking any blame off us, that it wasn't communicated well to the agencies that, oh, this is available and you could utilize this resource. But so I think with having someone with like Jarrell on board finally, we can correct those situations.
Good. So we'll look for, in terms of, the question about the call for projects and, questions about when, probably there needs to be some sort of a public calendar that is developed and that provides that information to all the agencies that are part of CARPO.
Right, and we talked about the work program, the FY22 work program, for the first time at yesterday's TCC meeting, and we mentioned the fact that there would be the call for projects. We don't have a specific date in mind yet when it'll be issued, that it'll be on Monday or something to that effect, but I have a note to work with Jarrell on that to see when we'll do that. I suspect, what is today, October 2nd, I suspect it'll be within the next couple of weeks or so. There's plenty of time. We won't be adopting the FY22 UPWP until March of next calendar year. So there's a lot of time, but yeah, it'll be coming out quite soon.
Okay. There's a question in the chat box that I want to read from Janet Payne. And Janet asks, for 5307, since 5339 is included, does that amount supersede the Table 3A max operating assistance amount allowed? Or can the entire amount in the split letter up to the 3A max be spent on operating? Now, I don't know about you. You can read that in the chat yourselves. Everybody can access the chat. I have no idea what that means. David?
I know exactly what that means. So, and this, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we go into 5307, but the special rule about being able to use 5307 for operating for those agencies that have less than 100 buses, that's published in Table 3A, and that's what she's referring to here. The first part of your question, Janet, about superseding the maximum in the table, it does not. So you're still limited in 5307 to the maximum amount of operating funding in Table 3A. But you can use every bit of the 5307 that is split out to you guys up to that max on operating. It doesn't relieve that. So if your funding level exceeds the amount in Table 3A, then that would be the point where you would stop being able to spend it on operating, and then the rest would have to be spent on capital. But we still think that it provides maximum flexibility. But as the numbers increase, if the maximum amount doesn't go up, then at some point you will be limited to what you can spend on operating to what's in 3A, and then the rest would be for capital. Does that make sense?
I don't know if Janet is on the phone, I think.
Yeah, I think she's muted, so.
She may not be able to in a position.
Okay.
Oh, she said it's perfect, David.
All right, great. Thanks, Janet.
And that'll be the only time anybody's
Questions?
going to tell you you're perfect today. So just take it and run with it.
I'll take it and run with it.
I want to ask a question of, I'm going to pose this to Jeremy Scott, who many of you know. Jeremy is with ITRI. Jeremy, are you there? You're muted right now. I wonder if you could unmute.
I'm here.
Thank you, sir. So this is a little bit out of order, I guess, in terms of what we've been discussing related to the various sections, but it does go to this issue of notice to people and the calendaring or the timing of opportunities. You mentioned in a prep call we did the other day that the National Transit Database numbers are due on October 31st. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
What, I'm assuming that every one of the agencies on the call with us is aware of that, but just talk a little bit about the importance of the preparation of that data and how it impacts funding.
Well, I mean, every transit system is required to report all their service and financial data to the National Transit Database, and they are the data warehouse for FTA of all this data. And they will validate that information and verify it, and before it gets closed out, they might come back with issues. There's always issues. But that data that you report to them, once the report is closed out, which is usually by March of next year, then they'll use that information in 2 years, I guess, for 5307 funding. Revenue miles for smaller urban areas will be part of that calculation that determines the amount of funds earned by the urbanized area, the sum of the total of all the transit systems in that UZA.
So it really is important to think through the whole reporting process, and the fact that once those numbers are submitted, you're kind of stuck with them.
Yeah, no, you definitely need to think ahead how you want to report your data. Ideally it would be before you do your initial submission by October 31st. So yeah, between now and the end of the month, we would want to make sure that you understand the implications of how you're reporting that data. You could probably change it. It probably wouldn't look good after that it was submitted, but since it hasn't been closed out, there are options to make that change, but it's probably better to do that now for the initial submission and just deal with issues that come up by the National Transit Database.
Talk with us a little bit, Jeremy, and any of our other, anybody else can chime in on this as well, but talk a little bit about in 2020 going into 2021, the distinction between reporting. I call these hybrid trips. I call the trips where you can start out in a city, urban area, and then go to a rural area and return. Their reporting entities have the option to call those either rural trips or urban trips, if I'm not mistaken. That's in their discretion. How important is it, and what are the implications of characterizing a trip that could go either way, could be urban or rural? How important is that characterization as we look into 2020 and 2021?
Well,
What are the implications?
well, so the implications are, if you take a rural to urban or an urban to rural trip and report it as rural, that's going to maximize your 5311 funding and the money that comes back to the state in 5311. If you just switch that to report those as urban trips, it would maximize the 5307 that comes back to the state. And Kai, I know you're on the call, so if I misspeak anywhere, just let me know. And so you can actually, there's 3 ways you can report that. You could report that as rural, you could report them as urban, or you could essentially split them in half and report half as urban and half as rural. So, depending on how you report that, you also need to understand the implications of how those funds can be used. Right now, 5311 can be used for admin and or operating, which, both of those have different local match or non-federal match amounts. If you're trying to maximize your 5307, that can only be used for operating. So you just need to understand that implication. And if you're going to increase your 5307, it's going to necessarily decrease your 5311. So you'll need to come up with those admin funds from other sources as necessary.
It seems like, some of the local transit operators, because they do have a lot of rural citizens and beginning and end trips in rural communities, it seems as though historically there has been a motivation to, when you have the option to do so, to characterize a trip as rural. Right now, what is that? So
the other thing I should add as well is, so when you report for 5311, the funding formula, transit systems it's about 5 cents a mile, or revenue mile. For 5307, it's around 50 cents a mile. So there's, it's a pretty big difference in the amount of money that's earned per revenue mile that's provided.
And that relates to urban travel only, correct?
Well, I mean, if it's rural and if you report a trip as rural, then it would be rural revenue miles, and you get 5 cents per mile earned in that case. But if you report it as an urban trip, then they would be urban miles, and 50 cents per mile would be earned by the transit system.
I see. So talk a little bit about this complication in 2020 going into 2021 for agencies that have characterized many trips as rural for purposes of drawing down funds associated with rural trip funding.
I guess I'm unclear about the complication.
Well, I'm thinking in terms of the state funding that's available.
Yeah, I guess I'm not understanding what complication you're referring to. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, let's just.
So Mary, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So one thing to consider is that the data that we submit is about 2 years. It's 2 years before it's utilized by FTA. So they're always about a year or two behind on the data that's used in the formula for the next year's award. And so in the case of, now that we're running up on the census year, that we're collecting the data this year, that data will probably be available in about 2 years. So if you report as you normally have, then in 2 years, the population portion may shift dramatically and change the funding. So if you move to be more reliant on urban, you should be thinking about that in your submission now so that it matches up with your award in 2022 or 2023. So I think that's what we kind of talked about. If you realize that there's a shift happening, you need to make sure that you're considering that shift within your reporting now as it will become effective in a couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's very important that you need to think about that now because there is that delay. So, and Janet's in a chat, and she was. Are you referring to the rope discontinuation for FY21, Mary?
I'm sorry, what was that, Jeremy?
You were asking about the complications in state funding. Are you referring to the rope funds that were
Yes, yes,
misallocated for FY21?
that's correct.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if Pam can speak to that. It's, I'm not exactly sure what you.
Yeah, no, we'll get, maybe I'm a little bit ahead of our program. And we'll get to that when we talk about ROPE and SMAP and some of the state funding that has been at least temporarily suspended. Well, let's do this. We are at 11:05. Let's take a break. We'll come back at 11:15 and we can take some more questions then, but we have to also proceed with our program. How's that?
Like a plan.
All right.
All right.
Take a quick break, everybody, and we'll be back. Next slide. And we are going to start talking about a section of the FTA known as the Urbanized Area Formula Funding Program, or 5307. So let's go ahead and progress the slides, Theo, and I'm going to turn over the controls to Jarrell.
All right. So 5307, as Mary just said, Urbanized Area Formula Funding Program is available specifically to urbanized areas for transit capital, operating assistance within the urbanized area, but it can also be utilized for transportation planning tied to these said activities. So any urbanized area that is 50,000 or more is eligible for such funds that are designated by the U.S. Census Bureau. The 2020 census is going to likely increase the size of the CRTPO planning area, which is primarily our urbanized area here in Charlotte. Let's move forward. So, as you can see in the 2000
Jarrell,
yes.
Quick. You keep using the word urbanized there when you're talking about 5307 because it applies to trips, ridership, transit that is characterized as taking place in an urban area. Is that okay?
Correct. So anything that only pertains to the U.S. Census designated urbanized areas is eligible for 5307. Anything that's outside of those said designated areas would automatically be considered rural, meaning it would be only eligible for those 5311 funds. The U.S. Census is very specific about these said areas for particular reasons, but it is one of the particular reasons that is primarily relevant to our conversation today is 5307, meaning you cannot use 5307 for any type of rural activities whatsoever. You will get in serious trouble with FTA. It's just not something you want to do. So you have to make sure your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, and it is specifically occurring within said urbanized area that you're receiving funds for. Okay, moving forward. So we're looking at the 2000 Charlotte urbanized area map. As you may see, there's some additional colors outside of the green. The green is specifically the Charlotte urbanized area per the 2000 census numbers. The other areas that is magenta, purple, red, and blue, they were considered urban clusters in the 2000 census breakout. Let's try to move it forward for 1 second. As you notice, pretty much all of those said, I'll go back to the previous slide real quick. Those said areas now per the 2010 census, which is what we're still operating on until the 2020 numbers come out, is all in green. So an urban cluster is an area below 50,000, but it's urbanized. So it falls below the urbanized area recognition. So you only can apply for 5311 funds prior to being considered part of an urbanized area. So urban cluster, urbanized area. Two different things, but they are very important to understand the distinction. And when 2010 occurred, everything went green, and it even slightly expanded beyond said borders. All right, moving forward. So the eligible activities under 5307, planning, engineering, design, evaluation of transit, technical, such as consultants, hiring, so on and so forth, for transportation related activities. That is the primary thing that people usually know off top comes with 5307. For other related activities is bus related replacement programs, bus related infrastructure like shelters, trash cans, signage. You can use that, and also maintenance of those said passenger facilities can be used by 5307 funds. You can also use it for fixed guideway. And to clarify what fixed guideway is, that's bus rapid transit, i.e. the buses that become express buses that use the I-77 managed lanes. Also, the busway on Independence Boulevard that has operated in the past, that's considered fixed guideway. But the primary thing that most people associate with fixed guideway in our local area is the blue line and the streetcar, which is the gold line of CATS. But other operators can be eligible for said activities if they provide an express bus that utilize a dedicated lane, such as a managed lane or busway. So everyone in this area who operates a fixed route service could actually utilize that. Also, the other primary responsibility of 5307 is meeting ADA requirements with a complimentary paratransit service. Several of our operators operate some variation of this said service activity. CATS has STS, MTS is technically falls under that with their operation. You just have to make sure you meet that compliance. No, because that is one of the strict requirements of 5307. You can also purchase computer software that's related to transportation, such as transportation service software, to make sure you stay on time with operations of said service. All right, moving forward. I'm going to pass the torch to our friends at CATS to explain this slide.
All right. So 5307 funds and how they flow. CATS is the designated recipient of the Section 5307 funds. So they come from FTA directly to CATS. We do the calculation using the local formula for sharing those, and then we prepare a split letter that goes to FTA that awards shares to all the other agencies. So if you go ahead and click again. In the case of the agencies in North Carolina, within our urbanized area, so Iredell, Mecklenburg and Union, NCDOT acts as a direct recipient on their behalf and awards the funds to them through their normal method. Let's go to the next bullet. For South Carolina, the RFAT stands for Rock Hill Fort Mill Area Transportation Study. That's their MPO name, like ours is CRTPO. They're a direct recipient of FTA, and they get their money by applying for them directly with FTA. All right, next one. And since 2016, CATS has calculated the shares and issued a split letter to FTA with copies to basically everybody: CRTPO, ICATS, MTS, Union County, RFATs, and NCDOT. And prior to 16, I think the only one that was eligible was ICATS, and they were a subrecipient to CATS at the time until we worked out the arrangement for NCDOT to become the direct recipient on their behalf. Let's go to the next slide. So in our area, we're MPO over 200,000 in population. And so a special rule comes into being. It used to be that if you were over 200,000 in population, you could only use the money on capital expenses. They changed this a couple of federal formulas ago. It might have been under the MAP Act that allowed for a special rule. If you have more than 100 or less than, if more than 100 buses, you still. We're talking at 5307 for capital. If you're under 100 buses, then you can use some portion for operating assistance within limits. And so those limits are defined. If you're less than 100 but more than 50, it's a smaller amount than if you're less than 50 buses. You know, so that comes out in that table 3A that Janet had talked about, and it publishes the maximum amount that can be spent on operating. All right, let's go to the next one.
David, question. Theo, if you could just
Go back.
switch back quickly. Why, help me understand something. 5303 and 5307 both provide for federal funds for transit. What's the difference? Why and when would I go for funds under 5303 versus 5307?
So 5303 is, when FTA gives you money, they give them to you in these different pots or silos. And so the 5303 funds, each of those have different requirements. For 5303, those are primarily for planning. It's for you to do long range planning, to look ahead, to try to plan for the future. And so there's limitations on what those funds can be spent for. You can spend the funds doing preliminary planning, long range planning, model work, but you can't do NEPA level planning or, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. If you're going to start doing that level of planning, which is now you're in the point of planning, and you're doing design, you're starting to get ready to implement a project. That's why you do NEPA. You've crossed the line. Now you're into the point where you're implementing a project. You need to be using capital funds, which is 5307. 5307, though, has the most flexibility. You can use them just about for anything. And so,
but don't those, David, don't the 5307 monies technically cost more than 5303 for a local agency?
So,
Mary, Jeff, if I could add to this, the 5303 is earned by each system based on their passenger numbers, their mileage generated and such, and there's no cost involved per se. Each system earns their share of the 5303, and then it's administered via North Carolina DOT every year. The monies can also go not only for planning, as David's saying, I mean, the planning items he mentioned, but also it can cover part of the salary of a planner, for instance, at the MPO or at the transit system, and you can do passenger counts, traffic counts with it, this sort of thing. But there's no cost more or anything I think you're thinking between what 5311 is worth at a nickel versus 50 cents for the 5307.
That's not what
5303 is a different animal.
Yeah, no, that's not where I was going, Jeff, but thank you for clarifying that 5303 funds can be used to pay certain administrator salaries, director salaries, for example. But the point I'm making is the match amount that is required for 5303 funds and 5307. As a layperson, I think of that as the cost.
So let's go back. So Jeff is right that you can use these for those other items that he mentioned. I think, so for 5303, traditionally, the state of North Carolina has provided a 10% match. And so we get 80% from the feds, 10% from the state, 10% local to be able to spend those funds. Hopefully that will continue. On 5307 funding, it's 80-20 for capital. If you choose to use 5307 for planning, which you can, you have to put it in the UPWP just like you do 5303, and you pretty much follow the rules of 5303, but you're going to have to provide a 20% match. It's rare that agencies do that. CATS has started to do that more, and that's because you do some planning on a project. Specifically, we do it with projects. You do planning on a project. If you do it on the 5307 side, then you're declaring your intent to implement that project. And if you don't implement that project, technically FDA can ask you to return the federal funds you spent. if you do the planning, the preliminary planning work up to the point of prior to NEPA, you can do that with the planning funds, and those don't have to be returned if you don't advance the project. So, you know, realistically between the two, there's no earning more or less. There's some advantageous pieces on 5303 because the state has been providing a 10% match. You can ask them to match the others, but probably not going to have the capability of doing that.
What about the 50-50 match on operating assistance under 5307? That is what I would call a higher cost.
It is a higher cost, but so 5303 is not eligible for operating expenses. Now, if you're paying portion of a person's salary who's working on planning, that is an eligible piece. But you can't pay for half of someone's salary or 80% of someone's salary who's working on other aspects of the project. And so 5307 is 80-20 for capital, 50-50 for operating. And the reason that the feds do that, the interpretation I hear is that they're encouraging you to support yourself. You need to have more money in the game. That's why it used to be when you're a really large NPO above 200,000, they used to stop giving you operating money altogether. You should be able to stand on your own. And the special rule brought that back for some of the smaller agencies that are also above that $200,000 threshold. What I think you may be referring to is the difference between 5311 and 5307. And 5311, I believe, and this is where I'd need Pam or Jeremy to chime in. There may be some more advantageous pieces for 5311 related to admin costs, where I don't think you can use that for 5307. Jeremy or Pam, could you speak to that?
I had trouble taking off my mute button. This is Pam. Yes, there is opportunity for administrative funds through the 5311 program as of right now. So, and there is a share cost with that as well. So that is there.
All right. So,
and can I just say, if you're like me, one of the things that you're doing is I have a list in front of me and I'm writing down the various sections and kind of the pros and cons, and I call it cost, the match amount, etc. So hopefully you've got your scorecard there in front of you too. Helps you kind of keep all this straight.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the next slide and we'll start trying to get into some more details about 5307. So this is starting to talk about how we distribute it locally. So once we get the pot of money in, and I'll walk us through the federal formula, and when we start applying the local formula, CATS uses the local formula that was approved by the MPO that distributes the funds. We use a third based on the annual vehicle revenue miles, a third based on the fleet size. And so the issue with fleet size is you can't have a van be the same as a 40-foot bus. And so we use bus equivalents. So we could use the National Transit Database data set. We can get the total number of seats within a fleet, believe it or not. We divide by 44, and there's your adjusted number of buses. And so then we're using bus equivalents when we do that part of the calculation. And then the final third is based on ridership. And this is meant to have, the vehicle revenue miles we feel like it's a good surrogate for operating expenses. The bus fleet size is a good surrogate for capital expenses. And then the last third based on ridership is a good performance metrics. And then that you're expending these funds, and then what is that return on the expense is that you're growing ridership. So if you continue to grow in your service, you continue to grow in the size of your fleet, or if you continue to growing your ridership, then each time you would do better and better in this formula.
But David, just again, to clarify,
yeah,
and please don't let me mistake, just again, the miles, the ridership is all urban that gets
yes.
calculated here. So if you've got a lot of rural miles in your community for whatever reason, 5307 does not provide any, well, unless and to the extent you have urban miles, you don't qualify here.
This kind of goes back to the conversation we were having before, but if you've got, you know, rural miles and urban miles, they go into the NTD, they do their calculation, then if it's reported as rural, then it goes to the part of the formula that's generating funding to our state based on 5311. And so it comes out on that side of it. If it goes in as urban, then it goes into the part of the equation that calculates what the Charlotte, North Carolina, South Carolina urbanized area gets. And so if you've reported your miles in one pot, then what you're going to receive or should be eligible to compete in that pot. But you can't use, after the fact, once the money's awarded, you have two pots of federal money. You can't cross the data anymore. So you need to stick with urban data when you talk about urban money. You need to talk about rural data when you talk about rural money.
So,
because that's how the money is distributed and how it comes to us.
Thank you. So a question from Richard Buchanan. With this formula, how do contracted vendors get counted in fleet size?
So it comes down to what the agency is reporting in the National Transit Database. And so that's pulled. So for Mecklenburg County, they use taxis. So they contract with taxis. And so there's a category called demand response taxi, and whatever the fleet was reported as, that's what's taken, and the number of seats are reported for that too. That's an area where in the past they have had some underreporting, but that's what goes in the formula that generated the number. So we stick with the data that was used. So the data that we're using is the data that FTA is using for their calculation.
So, and that's, David, that's the NTD data we submit ourselves, correct?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's go to the next slide. And I think this will, hopefully, this may be confusing. This is, you know, we talk about the federal formula. This is the federal formula. This is their flow chart of how it works. And so you get, you know, I'm going to try to highlight a couple of areas so that you see how we work this and where we start applying the local formula. But one of the things we talked about, let me see if I can find it on here, is
and David, just for purposes of our audience,
yes,
and their ability to view this well and effectively, you might want to pop out the screen sharing portion of your. Each one of us can adjust our own view.
Yeah.
And so for purposes of your view option, why don't you go to fit to the window 100%, that first one at the top, so that you can pick up on some of this teeny tiny information. And there was nothing to be done about the slide. It's just complicated, but you can change your view.
All right. So you can see at the very top, you know, we'll just stay right here for a second. At the very top, you get the appropriated amount. This is the amount that comes from Congress on an annual basis. And you can see some pieces that are pulled off to the side. But then you get down to the bottom of the, you know, or just before the remaining amount, you see reapportioned funds. So basically, if you go years and years without spending your money, it goes back to the feds and they stick it back into this formula. But then we come over to the green box. So 90.68% of those funds at the national level are allocated to the urbanized areas of 200,000 or greater. So we're in the most competitive pot. We get the biggest pot of money, but we have a lot more competition with bigger agencies. If you click it again, I think twice. Well, there we go. So you see the blue box, that's fixed guideway tier. So CATS is the only one that does fixed guideway tier. We use the federal formula to calculate out what the fixed guideway amount is. And CATS keeps that portion. We're the only one providing data. We're the only one operating that. So we calculate that and keep it. Then on the right side, you see the bus tier. That's again at the federal form. If we click twice again, you get the incentive and the non-incentive tier. So it used to be that on the incentive tier, this is bus passenger miles traveled squared divided by operating cost. Literally, this formula was made by Congress. So there you go. That one, it used to be that CATS was the only one providing data that went into that calculation. And so that wasn't shared. In the last 2 years, Mecklenburg County has become a full reporter a few years ago, and their data has started to show up. So this one, we do a proportional share based on that federal calculation. And then what we have left is the non-incentive tier. If we click one more time, so that pot, that 90%, 73% at the national level goes to populations of more than 1 million. This is where we stopped following the federal formula. And now we utilize the CRTPO formula for that remaining amount, 1/3 based on vehicle revenue miles, and it's the bus vehicle revenue miles, 1/3 based on the fleet size, and then 1/3 based on ridership. The main reason is because when you start looking at population and population density, determining what that area is versus service area becomes very difficult. And so that's why the MPO at the time chose to go with a more simplified version of using data that was readily available from NTD to be able to do that calculation and finish it off. I'm gonna pause here and see if there's any questions about this, because I know this is really complex.
So David, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm gonna go back one step up with the blue incentive tier box.
Mm-hmm.
Can you further elaborate about who qualifies for the incentive tier specifically, so that our audience can understand what exactly is going on and we are all on the same page together?
Yeah, so what they're doing is at the national level, they're looking at bus passenger miles traveled, which is basically it's ridership multiplied by the length of their trip. It's something that is reported in NTD, but it's only reported if you're a full reporter. In the National Transit Database, you can be a full reporter reposits a lot more data. You can be a reduced reporter and this data isn't submitted. It's not requested, it doesn't show up, and so it's not available to be in the federal calculation. My understanding right now, CATS and Mecklenburg County are the only 2 full reporters. I believe, in the current data, Iredell and Union and South Carolina all still show up as partial reporters. So they're not providing this data. If they were to change and become a full reporter and this data goes in, it would show up in the federal information. We would earn more money in this category based on the data they submitted, and then we would be able to proportionally share it as well. But right now that data is not there. At the same time, we go to the fixed guideway tier, which we talked a little bit earlier. I talked a little bit earlier about that includes high intensity motor bus. That's an area where at some point in time, I could see the potential for some of the other agencies in our area to be able to operate high intensity motor bus. If they became a full reporter, I think that data may show up as well. Especially if you're using, say, express buses on 77, that would show up. So
David,
that's to kind of keep in mind. Yes.
David, question just came in related to the one you're addressing.
Mm-hmm.
Teresa Torres asks, can we send you the data so that it can be reported?
No, I cannot report for another agency. You have to report that data yourself. Well, I am not aware that we could do that. I think you'd have to report it yourself. You're currently reporting all your data to NTD, aren't you, Teresa?
Go ahead and open your mic, Teresa.
She may be on the phone.
No, I'm here. So we do report our information to NCDOT, but I was wondering, can we send data to be put in the formula for the figuring out how much money union gets?
So unless it shows up in the national transit-based data, then it's not generating any money for our area. So it needs to show up in the NTD. It's be something that you guys would have to submit. Either I thought you guys were a direct reporter reporting directly to NTD, and this is something, if you became a full reporter, that data would probably be included.
Thank
David,
you.
I've heard the term used, reduced reporter. Are you saying that are ICATS and Union County reduced reporters? Is that the right term?
I think that's correct. And I'm going to tell you, I might need some help from Jeremy or Pam on this one, because I'm not an expert on NTD data. I just use it. So, but as far as reporting goes, there are different classifications. And, you know, Jeremy, can you help me with that? Is that something that they can choose to do, or is it based on their size?
Well, so they are reduced reporters. There are additional oversights that are required. I don't know what would need to be done to become a full reporter, but I know if you do that, you do have to report on a monthly basis as opposed to on an annual basis. So there is more oversight and more rules they have to follow in that regard.
Okay.
If I could just pose one question that popped up in the box from Janet Payne. And this followed on Richard Buchanan's question before about the formula. With this formula, how do contracted vendors get counted in fleet size? David addressed that. And then Janet asked, would the supplemental providers for Medicaid transit for each county be included if the contractor reports an NTD, so the database, but the county doesn't report the subcontractor? Ooh, that's complicated.
So I will try to answer that, and then I will see if others can add to it. But when we, and I can pull it up and show you how we do this if we have time at the end. But the National Transit Database, there's actually, if you go to the FTA's website, you look at how they generate the money. They have all of the tables they use are included in the data sets. And so when I pull the data set for the Charlotte, North Carolina, South Carolina urbanized area, I can select it down to all the data providers that show up. I am not aware of a vendor that is showing up as a reporter within that data. I do know that, for instance, anything you guys are reporting is showing up. But again, if you're not a full reporter, there's certain items you don't have to do. And so I'd have to look at that. I don't know of any vendor data that's showing up. But in other areas, there are, you know, others do show up. I don't see any right now.
Okay.
Jim, do you know anything about that? Because that would be more of a NTD expertise kind of question, and that's out of my wheelhouse.
Anybody? Looks like Kai Monast has posted, only public transportation providers report to the NTD. Most Medicaid brokerages do not carry the general public, and therefore they are not public transportation providers.
Thank you, Kai.
All right.
There's the answer.
Okay, David.
All righty. So let's go ahead and click again. So once we've applied all these pieces, then this comes out, and this is the final apportionment. And again, we've done the piece with the credit for 5339, so that adjustment is in here. But that's how we get to the allocation each year. And so we take the total of 19.76 million to start with. We do the calculation to separate out the fixed guideway and the incentive tier pieces. And then the remainder is applied to the local formula. And then we do the adjustment for 5339 to get to this total. And I think that the next meeting, we're going to get in a lot more detail about the formula itself. And we can go through it, maybe even have some practices of how it's calculated. So I don't want to get too far down on that today, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions that we have, because I think we're at the end of my piece here.
Anybody? Now's if you have a question at this point, I'm happy to address it.
Okay.
All right. Nothing, David. So let's keep, now we'll turn over to Pam. Oh, wait a minute. We did get a
Next
question. Here's Janet. Hold on.
All right.
Question to everyone. So whoever is qualified to address this among our technical folks, could the quote non-full close quote reporters or reduced reporters provide the components of data that aren't captured in the NTD, but that we do have available to report from something called Route Match? I guess that's a program directly to CATS to include in the local formula.
So the answer to that is we could, but we look at that as that would really be fair. So the money that is being generated in the federal formula is based on the data that is submitted to NTD. If we start then bringing in other local data that's not submitted, then we are diluting the share that is really being earned by those that are submitting. So right now that's only CATS in Mecklenburg County, but you know, those agencies are providing that data that is in the calculation that earns us money. If you guys were able to submit that to NTD, then it would earn the region more money and you would get your share based on that formula. But it doesn't seem right to take an amount based on a smaller data set and then divide it even further when you're not reporting that data and bringing those funds to the region. And then
here's another question from also from Janet. Why, and this may be getting ahead of ourselves into our next program, but I'll pose the question. Why and how does the local calculation differ from the FTA calculation used to determine the amount of 5307 funds that are awarded to our UZA?
So you're right. We'll get much more into this next time. But if you click back one slide, you know, I can point that out, and at least you can see the difference here, and then we can get into much more detail next time. But so we followed the federal formula all the way to that very last green box at the bottom, and this is where we start applying the local formula. So the difference here is that the federal formula would try to look at 50% based on bus vehicle revenue miles, 25% based on population times population density. So it's population squared divided by area, and 25% based on population alone. The real problem in this portion is what percent or what portion of population goes to each area. When you're doing this calculation for regions in comparison, which is what FTA is doing, it's a lot easier to follow this because you have distinct service areas and distinct populations. When you cross down into, you know, an MPO and you have a lot of service area, then that becomes more questionable. And so one of the calculations that was done, I think, by the consultant for Union looked at this, and they did a calculation. They only showed the population of the city of Charlotte for CATS, whereas CATS is a countywide operation. And we have routes that extend beyond that. You also look at the draw of where the patrons are coming from, the users from the region. We talk about regionalism. You know, when we do the modeling to forecast, you know, ridership for light rail, when you get to the ends of the lines, the park and ride lots, the draw for those is about 10 miles. When you get to bus park and ride lots, that draw is around a 5-mile radius, or not a radius because you don't drive out to come in, but think of a cone shape heading outward. And so those patrons a lot of times are from surrounding counties too. So that's the hard part, is how would you determine what population to share? Rather than trying to get into that, which is what Raleigh says, you know, the capital area MPO says is the most controversial piece. We did the formula that says we're going to take it now and we'll apply the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 based on data that's readily available. And so that's how we got to that formula. And we can talk a lot more about that next month, but I hope
That's right.
Based toward answering that question.
Yeah. No, thank you, David, for doing that. And that is, as everybody knows, that's our next meeting, is to really take apart the 5307 formula, understand it, do some comparisons. So stay tuned. That's coming.
All right.
Well, I think we switch over to Pam now.
Yeah. And
Yes, ma'am. So now we're going to talk about the ROPE program and the SMAP program. And it's important to note that these two programs are state-funded programs through the legislation, and they're authorized and managed, allocated by the NC Department of Transportation. The Rural Operating Assistance Program is specifically designated for the rural areas, and it consists of 3 programs that are subsets of the ROPE program, which include the Rural General Public, the Elderly and Disabled, the EdTAP, and then the Employment Transportation Assistance Program. The SMAP program, which is the State Maintenance Assistance Program, is specifically designated for the urban areas. And again, it is funded and authorized by the state legislature. And it's specifically for the operating assistance to the fixed route transit systems. Next slide. So we've provided the 5-year look for Ardell, Mecklenburg, and Union counties ROPE authorizations. And as you can see, they've increased a little bit over the past 5 years. You can proceed to the next slides. However, for fiscal year 21, the state legislature had eliminated the ROPE and SMAP programs from the state budget. You can proceed to the next slides. So it was House Bill 77 a few months ago that had been passed by North Carolina General Assembly that eliminated funding for both programs. And that was about $50 million. And the intention of that elimination was only for one fiscal year. And the expectation is that these programs would be refunded in FY22. But it had been eliminated from the line items for FY21. So what happened when the pandemic came around, the CARES Act was passed on the federal level and authorized millions of dollars that had been allocated to the Department of Transportation for its designated recipients to assist in the response to the pandemic. We've received the allocations that have funneled through the federal formula funds of 5311 and 5307, the EdTAP program as well, which we utilized these programs to distribute this funding. So with that, the CARES Act program was solely designated for that federal funding assistance for this sort of one-time pandemic response, and it is 100% federally funded. And we've been going through our contracts process pretty expeditiously, in addition to sending that out throughout the various levels of authorizations that need to go through within our division.
Pam, is there any matching? You say that the allocations are made to each transit agency using existing 5307 and 5311. Is there a matching component?
No, so Mary, I just want to clarify that. So the CARES Act funding is 100% federal funds. However, as we distributed this funding, figuring out which systems got which amount of allocation, it was funneled through the formula process for the 5311 program and the 5307 program, but it did not require the matches because it was 100% federal assistance.
I see. Where do things stand with regard to can I just ask the local agencies that are part of RNPO? Are they're in the process of, it says their applications are being processed now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I guess I'm just assuming that everybody on the call who represents one of those agencies knows where things stand. That's not our all business, but I imagine they know that.
Yes, and they have contacts within our division, the mobility development specialists that they can, which is myself for this area, reach out to me, which I would coordinate with our finance unit to respond to their inquiries.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's questions here. Anybody in the chat or otherwise? No?
Question.
Sir.
So, Pam, going back to the ROPE and SMAP funds, could you explain how the contribution, I would assume with ROPE particularly, has gone down for the 3-county area over the last couple of years, and kind of go into detail what, why that's occurred, and what do you guys see happening, I guess, in the future with our 3-county area involving rural funds?
You know, thanks, Jarrell. I appreciate your question. As you know, this ROPE and SMAP funding is a critical component to the transit system's operating budgets for this rural general public and the other programs for the populations assisted. There is uncertainty going into an FY22 to address that question. And again, it's at the behest of the state legislature. It's important to keep track of, the number of trips and funding. So the state, through our division, is sending out a lot of surveys and inquiries on trip numbers to the systems to make sure that we track so that we can advocate. Well, we not necessarily advocate, but be able to present the state legislature with appropriate data that would warrant that would show the information to make sure that the funding is restored. As far as going back into the past history of the 5-year overview, there has been some subtle decreases within that 5-year purview. I don't, from, as I look at Ardell County, FY16 to 17, it was a $2,000 decrease. I don't have the specifics in front of me on that methodology that was used then, but if overall it did increase, a little bit beyond that, but aside from those subtle decreases, but I think overall in general, I think you can say it did overall increase over the past 5 years. But again, I would need to check on that formula funding on how that was done, and I wasn't privy to that at that time.
Can we come to the summation that you guys use a methodology that can regularly change, whereas the 5311 methodology is fixed for 10 years. Is that a good assumption to assume, saying the methodology for rope and SMAP can change depending on whatever dynamics are going on in that 10-year window? But in comparison, 5311 is just fixed for the next 10 years. Is that a correct assumption to make?
I don't think that I don't want to assume, and I don't want to verify an assumption. So again, I would have to go back and verify where the status of that is.
I'd just jump in here. The rope formula has not changed recently. It's parts of it are legislated, and the other part.
Excuse me just a minute, Kai. Would you identify yourself and your organization, please?
Yeah, I'm Kai Monis with ITRI at NC State.
Thank you.
Yeah. So anyway, the rope formula hasn't changed recently. There's three components to it. There's the EdTap, which is elderly and disabled. There's the employment, and then there's the RGP. So if you've noticed any decrease, I would imagine it would just be the rural general public amount that's gone down, primarily based on census data. And Jeremy has the formula. He can probably explain it better than me, but it has been stable for a long time.
And then, oh, go ahead.
No, Pam, please.
No, I see a Kai. I see the question from David McDonald. Can you speak to the NCDOT's eligibility requirements to receive SMAP funding?
Yes, the SMAP's been around since 1993, and the eligibility we tried to address a couple of years ago because it's been a little bit inconsistent, but essentially it's almost like a grandfathered situation right now. You've got urban fixed route providers are all eligible, but community transportation deviated fixed route providers have not historically been eligible. And then you've got a couple of oddballs, Wilson City and Apple Cart, which are rural 5311 recipients, but they existed back when SMAP was first created. And so they get SMAP money as well. So it fully acknowledged that there's issues with eligibility on SMAP. And there's reasons why some people might think they're eligible, but haven't historically been eligible.
Can I want to ask a question here. I don't feel like I really understand, and I might be the only person on the call, so I'll speak for myself, but I don't understand the relationship between ITRI and NCDOT and some of the local transit agencies. ITRI's name, the entity comes up, is mentioned frequently, but I guess I just don't really understand. Kai, can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so we've been under contract NCDOT for 20 some years to provide technical assistance to NCDOT and the transit systems. A lot of that involves technology, but it also moves into data. And then because it involves data, that's how the formulas are based on the data. So it puts us into the formula world as well.
Any questions about that, anybody?
But it's an entity out of NC University, I believe.
That's right. Yeah, we are employed by NC State University. But we have a team of 4.5 people that are basically fully funded by NCDOT to help the Integrated Mobility Division. So yeah, it can be confusing at times, but Pam and I speak on a regular basis. We basically try to support NCDOT as much as possible and support the transit systems as well.
Besides NCDOT, do you have any other contracts?
We have some research opportunities, but no other public sector contracts, no. Not our group.
So Kai, do y'all give advice to the local transit agencies on how to report their data? Do you advise them on that of, when they have options, like we talk about these urban, rural, I call them hybrid trips, which they have the option to report either way. Do you help them understand how to do that?
We help them understand their choices. We help them analyze their data. When it comes down to how they're going to report, whether it's going to be a rural trip or an urban trip, that is a local decision that we try to make very obvious, very clear. Like it's kind of, it's kind of a game, and you got to figure out what's best for your local situation. So we don't tell people what we think they should do. It's up to their unique situation.
Anybody else? Questions?
So one clarification for SMAP is that that formula does not recognize any of the fixed route service in Charlotte. None of the rail is included. It's only bus. So every time we open a new rail line, and you're doing that to provide more efficiency to carry more folks because that was your highest ridership bus route, then we're actually taking data out of that formula. So it harms us. That was one of the things that a couple of years ago we were trying to work with the state when they were looking at re-examining that formula, but it kind of fell through. I think it has been, set so long, like Kai said, that it's kind of grandfathered, and it's specifically awarded to those individual operators, agencies, not to the MPOs. And so that's something that definitely think that, there could be some more look at those formulas in the future and trying to see how to improve them. But right now we're hoping that they'll be back after a year off, which of course, that suspension for a year was NCDOT's and the legislature's attempt to try to balance the budget, because NCDOT is having some significant financial issues right now.
There's a note in the chat box from Jeff Crouchley, who is with Iredell County's ICAT system. He said that there are other organizations similar to ITRI in Florida, Texas, et cetera, that contract around the country. And I just asked a question of Jeff, if you're on our call still, do you work with any of those other groups? Does ICATS work with any of those other groups? If it's appropriate to ask, I don't know.
I can chime in here, Mary. A lot of those, so it's Cutter in Florida, CUTR, and some other similar organization in Texas. They do a lot of work with the National Rural Transit Assistance Program to assist with the training and technical assistance elements for the rural and travel transit operators on the national level. So there's a lot of training assistance there that our operators can tap into as well. But those research and data organizations, such as in Florida, Texas, and that we have here in North Carolina, do assist with that. He is correct.
Yeah. The other big one is the National Transit Institute, which is actually housed in Rutgers University, and they do a tremendous amount of training associated with transit. And so each of these are, basically collaborations between government and universities for the public benefit. So.
Correct. NTI, National Transit Institute, NTI is actually the main sponsor for most of the National Transit Database webinars and training courses that come out annually by the Federal Transit Administration. So they are actually offering several courses. I can resend a email correspondence that was sent a couple weeks ago where that specifies how to report data. It's a 4-day webinar course that is sponsored by them. To my knowledge, it is free for most public entities. So I could resend it out again after this meeting so that everyone is aware. I know they held their first session this week, but they have 3 other sets of sessions between now and November.
All right. Well, final questions as we get ready to wrap up. We have a little bit of time if anybody else has anything additional they'd like to ask about. I see Bob Cook is leaving us now. Bye, Bob. And anybody on our task force or any of our guests today?
Mary, this is Wayne and Cornelius. I just want to take a moment to say I was a little tentative coming into this. I read the material and I was not sure I knew any more coming in than I knew a week ago. But I really do appreciate the presenters today because I've learned a lot. And the presentations were outstanding. So I want to say thanks to Pam, Jeremy, David, and Jarrell. I now think I have a much better understanding after listening to the explanations. It did create more questions, which I see on this what's next, that we're going to focus on the formula next time. So I think we're doing a great job of walking ourselves down the path, because everything I learned today, I think will feed into this next session about the formula. So job well done, and I appreciate the information.
Wayne, thank you so much. Everybody worked really hard. I can testify the presenters worked very hard on getting on sort of breaking down what is on its face a very complicated set of regulations, the federal piece, the state piece coming together. So thank you for those kind words. I think everybody appreciates them.
Hey, Mary, this is Bob, and I'm still here. But the one thing I did want to mention that I'm particularly happy about today is Pam's presence. You know, we've had what was the Public Transportation Division on our TCC roster for a long time, but a number of years ago, under former leadership, several leadership changes ago, they pulled out from active participation, and I think Pam maybe is back on board actively participating in the TCC. So I think that's going to be a big help to us as we try to understand transit, how it affects what the CRTPO does. So I really want to call out Pam and thank her for participating today. I think it's a big step forward for us.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It is one of the missions and goals to have that active presence. And I'll be, even though I won't be able to attend every single meeting monthly, it is our goal to have that presence there and be active in that conversation and participate in with the transit systems and planning elements. But I appreciate you acknowledging that.
Well, one thing as we get ready to wrap up here, I want to hear from our chair of CARPO and our vice chair, of course, some closing words. But one thing that occurs to me is there is a lot of stress and pressure on our local transit agencies when it comes to having to understand, you know, how to sort of push on these various levers, these various regulations in order to maximize return, to people in their local community and to support them in their transit needs. And I'm talking about that in terms of right now, trying to help people, but also thinking prospectively, you know, we've seen in this devastating year of pandemic, you know, this ROPE and SMAP, you know, being curtailed for this time, the CARES Act money coming in, but local transit agencies have a ton of decisions they have to make and have to really understand how the interplay of these various regulations. So if I'm going to speak for CARPO, I mean, CARPO is your organization, and to the extent that you need help or you need advice, I know Jarrell is there, and I know others are there standing by to be of assistance, and David to be of assistance. Mm-hmm. So Linda and Michael, you want to take us out?
Well, I did the opening comments, so I'll just say thanks again for all the presenters. I'm not sure Mary can totally claim she's the less educated person on this topic in the room, because I'm right close second or first. This has been very informative, and I'm looking forward. I think the way we sequence these topics is logical, and hopefully we'll get to a point where we all are comfortable with the final product. So thanks again to all the presenters. And to Mary.
Thank you.
Well, and I will just end by saying, I think today's session just confirmed for me that the transit funding, and I guess really all transportation funding, is unnecessarily complicated. It would be so nice if we could just have one or two pots of money that we could draw upon, but when it's separated into 5 or 6 different things with different requirements and matches, and I mean, it just blows your mind. I mean, there's no other way to do it. And Mary, I do want to thank you and Michael Johnson, because I think that both of you have really developed an understanding of this whole process and the complexity of it, certainly better than I have. I mean, I've learned a lot, but it is just, it's overwhelming for most of us who are not in the field. So I think today's session was helpful. I do think next week or next meeting, we'll get to what I guess originally brought us into this whole question, is looking at the formula. So, and I'm hopeful that once we do that, a lot of the things were said today is that some of these, there may be opportunity here for some readjusting, not just of the formula, but maybe how we report data and how we count trips, and hopefully ultimately this will find some better solution, because it does sound like the smaller agencies are on the verge of experiencing some real significant loss of funds if this rope is not put back into place. And at least next year, we know that won't be available. So I hope we can figure out something to do to give support to those agencies.
Well, thank you, Linda, for your closing words. I just want to tell everybody that, as we did with our last program where the transit agencies reported, we did have a sidebar discussion with ICATS. That is Michael Johnson and the leaders, Linda and Michael Miltic. And also with Union County, that any kind of sidebar discussion that anybody would like to have, please let us know, because this is, we've got to figure this out together across our region. One more point, we're getting into that kind of crazy time of year, even crazier in 2020, where we're looking towards holidays, and we're going to try our best to get our next meeting on the calendar for late October or early November. And that would be part 1 of the review of the 5307 formula. So look for our calendar invites. Please respond to them promptly. That helps all of us at this time of year to, just get the calendar set. So, my friends, I thank you all, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks again, Mary.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.